In Romans chapter 1, we find these words, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." Grammatically, the entire verse is in the present tense. There are three verbs, unashamed, is, and believes, all in the present tense. So Paul was not ashamed of the gospel. He knew it was for the Jew and the Greek. He also knew the power of God was demonstrated in the message. But now we need to ask ourselves whether we can make an application of this text. Do we as Christians actually believe the gospel is good news? And are we ashamed or unashamed of the gospel? Are there some visible signs as to whether we are ashamed or unashamed of the gospel? Here are some signs that we might be ashamed of the gospel. Number one, we are ashamed of the gospel because we are worried about offending people. Number two, we are ashamed of the gospel because we are a man pleaser rather than a God pleaser. Number three, we are ashamed of the gospel because we are afraid that we can't answer objections. Number four, we are ashamed of the gospel because we don't take the lordship of Jesus seriously. Number five, we are ashamed of the gospel because we don't really believe the gospel is true. Number six, we are ashamed of the gospel because we don't even know what the gospel actually is. Just pause for a moment and consider those two words, not ashamed. That's high praise for any Christian. Not ashamed to be a Christian, or not ashamed by the criticism that comes with being a Christian. Not ashamed to thank God publicly. And then we have these words by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Now with God's help, I will become myself. Without God's help, you will never become who you were meant to be. This is perhaps life's hardest question. Do you know who you are? Until you do, you'll never really know where you fit in. Once you know who you are, you can fit in anywhere. With that in mind, we return to the story of Joseph. When we last saw our hero, he had been betrayed by his brothers and sold to desert traders who took him to Egypt, where they sold him to a man named Potiphar, who was head of Pharaoh's security detail. He's far from home. He's a slave in Egypt. His brothers have abandoned him. His father thinks he's dead. As Genesis 39 opens, his future appears bleak indeed. There is one fact, and only one fact, that should give us any hope that his story will turn out well. After informing us that he is now a slave in Potiphar's house, the text adds one all-important detail in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. That fact makes all the difference. This is the story of Joseph's battle with sexual temptation. We will see how Potiphar's wife does all she can do to seduce this fine-looking young Hebrew slave. We'll also see how and why Joseph was able to resist her advances. Let's begin our investigation of this story with two revealing quotes. The British playwright Oscar Wilde once remarked, "I can resist anything except temptation." And his own life proved the truth of those words. And when we hear them, we chuckle because we all know in various ways how true they are. On the other side, C.S. Lewis, who observed that no man knows how bad he is until he has tried to be good. The first quote proves the second. It's precisely because we can't resist temptation that we learn how bad we really are and how greatly we stand in need of God's grace. Temptation is not new in any sense. Temptation is the same for us as it was for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Satan tempts us today in the same way he tempted Jesus in the wilderness. From the very beginning, a battle has raged for the souls of men and women, a battle that touches all of us sooner or later. What exactly is temptation? Here's a working definition. Temptation is the inner urge to do wrong that hits us in the place of our own personal weakness. I find that helpful because it emphasizes that temptation ultimately comes from the inside. While a stimulus may come from the outside, the urge to do wrong comes from the inside. That's hugely important because we all tend to blame something else or someone else when we fall into sin. But it's not the devil who made us do it, nor is it some titillating scene or some irritating person or some questionable entanglement. We can't blame our parents or our grandparents, and we can't blame our DNA. Those things are factors in the equation, but the inner urge belongs to us. We can't lay that off on people or circumstances. No one makes us sin. We do that on our own. The words of 1 Corinthians 10 and 13 remind us that while we all face temptation, God will always provide a way of escape if we're willing to take it. There's no better example of that truth than the case of Joseph in Genesis 39. From this familiar story, I find 5 principles that will help us in our personal struggles with the temptations of life. Principle number 1, when things are going well, be on guard. The scene is the royal court in Egypt. A man named Potiphar enters the room. He is the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, a position of great honor because it meant he was personally responsible for the Pharaoh's safety. At his side is a young man, not an Egyptian, a fact made clear by his appearance. If you were an onlooker, you would notice the young man immediately and say, I wonder where he came from. Medium brown hair, perhaps piercing blue eyes, casual walk of a teenager, high degree of self-confidence. As he follows Potiphar, all eyes follow him. He has it all: good looks, self-confidence, poise, and a playful sense of humor. And his name is Joseph. Wherever Potiphar goes, Joseph follows. They look good together, these two. Not father and son exactly. As a matter of fact, Potiphar had purchased Joseph as a slave from the Ishmaelites, so they couldn't be father and son. But they didn't seem like master and slave either. There's something else at work, a kind of friendship that seems to erase the culture that separates them. Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, likes this young man. And for his part, Joseph admires his master. This is how Moses puts the matter in Genesis 39, verses 2 through 4. The Lord was with Joseph and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. Potiphar was no dummy. He knew that the Lord's hand was upon this young man he had purchased as a slave. So he puts Joseph in charge of his house. Verses 4 through 5 clearly imply that he was a wealthy man with a large estate. Notice what happens when Joseph takes over. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. If you're counting, that's 5 times in 4 verses that Moses mentions how God blessed Joseph. There are 2 things we ought to learn from this. First, lost people are not stupid. They are lost in their sins, but even in their spiritual confusion, they can see the hand of God at work in a believer's life. Sometimes we act like lost people have no perception at all. It's true that they don't understand our doctrine, and they don't know what it means to be premillennial, but most of us aren't too clear on that either. And they don't get the Trinity, but we got trouble with that too. And lost people may not understand the finer points of doctrine, but I guarantee that this much is true. Lost people can spot a phony a mile away, and they can recognize God's hand at work in a believer's life. Potiphar may have followed a pagan religion, but he understood that Joseph was different, and he respected him for it. Second, there is no contradiction between God's blessing and our temptations. In fact, we are more likely to be tempted when things are going well. After all, when we are enjoying God's blessings, we often become complacent and take those blessings for granted. That's exactly when Satan wants to strike us. He hits us when things are going well. The lesson is clear. When everything is going your way, and when you've got the world by the tail on a downhill slide, and when you just got that promotion on your job, and when your popularity has never been higher, and when all your dreams start to come true, you better watch out. You better be careful. You better take nothing for granted. Keep your eyes open. Today's victories often lead to tomorrow's trials. Principle number 2, when you are tempted, remember who you are. It's exactly at this point, when Joseph seems to be sitting on top of the world, that a new character enters the story. We do not know her name, only that she is the wife of Potiphar, and she's connected to him in name only. To use a modern phrase, she's a single married woman. Verse 7 lays out the situation for us with unabashed directness. After a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." The Hebrew has a wonderful way of putting it. It literally says that she lifted up her eyes at Joseph. The Living Bible says that she made eyes at Joseph. As she crossed the room, she followed him with her eyes, a smile of satisfaction crossing her face. He was a fine-looking man, young and strong, the way Potiphar had been when they first met, before too many court dinners had spoiled his waistline, before too many late-night meetings with Pharaoh had placed bags under his eyes. And yes, this Joseph looked like an excellent companion for an entanglement. A brief meeting between a younger man and an older woman. And she must have been persistent, because when Joseph turned her down, she came back again and again. Perhaps she thought he didn't mean it when he said no. Perhaps she thought she could wear down his resistance. Perhaps she thought he wanted to, but he was afraid to say yes. Back she came, sliding back into his life, offering him the forbidden fruit, ripe and juicy, here's for the taking. Still, he said no. At this point, it's worth pausing to ask why a red-blooded young man would say no to an available woman. Verses 8 and 9 suggest 2 answers. Number 1, he was loyal to his boss. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one's greater in his house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife." And number 2, he was loyal to God. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Joseph did the right thing because he knew that adultery was wrong. He called it a wicked thing and a sin against God. These days, we like to rename sin to make it sound less sinful. Christians are now under great pressure to compromise our convictions, or if not to compromise, at least to keep quiet. We need not worry about the barbarians at the gate. They have breached the wall and are streaming in on every hand. There's a lot of discussion these days about the replacement for the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, aka the notorious RBG. How shall we respond? I suggest that we remember 4 simple words. The Supreme Court isn't. There's a court higher than the court that sits in Washington. That court is never divided, never uncertain, and never wrong. We show proper respect to the earthly courts even when we disagree. But we reaffirm our conviction that there's a judge who cannot be swayed by public opinion and whose rulings will never be overturned. We will carry on with tenacious courage, not changing our convictions about right and wrong. And we say with the psalmist, "Forever, O Lord, your word is settled in heaven." In times like these, we need an infusion of the Joseph spirit. so that we will do what he did. He calls Bible things by Bible names. He called it wickedness and a sin against God. Instead of a hard word like adultery, we use words like affair, fling, one night stand, making love, entanglement. Call it what you like. Adultery is still sin because God says so. Renaming sin doesn't change its character any more than calling rat poison food turns it into bread. Despite his flat refusal, she continued to seduce him day after day. And finally, she made her move. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." So what do you do now? She is grabbing him and pulling him down with her. This is the moment of truth. Joseph knew he belonged to God. And when a man knows that he belongs to God, it makes the decisions of life easier. If you belong to God, you can't sleep with your boss's wife. It's just that simple. It doesn't matter that she's lonely or attractive or available or anything else. You just can't do it. Period. End of the story. No discussion needed. He didn't mess around. He didn't flirt with trouble. He didn't say, "How far can I go?" He just said, no. And he didn't apologize for saying no. And he didn't worry about hurting her feelings. Principle 3, when you are tempted, act fast. Verse 12 tells us what happened next. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out the house. As I pondered the matter, I made a list of excuses Joseph might have given for sleeping with Potiphar's wife. You ready? Number 1, we're all alone, which is true. Number 2, she made me do it, also true. Number 3, no one else would probably know. That's probably true. She's in a bad marriage, very possible. I'm single and I got needs too, definitely true. I deserve this, not true. Everyone fools around, not true, but it sounds good. God will understand, definitely not true, but a popular excuse. It was all or nothing. Either he slept with her or he faced losing his job. He was first courteous, then cautious, then courageous, or maybe crazy, but he stayed cool and got out clean. When she said, "Why don't you stay for a while?" he said, "I'd love to, but I gotta run." And that's exactly what he did. Out the door, across the lawn, over the hedge, dodging camels as he went. He left a hole in his coat while he ran the other way. The King James Version uses a quaint expression to describe how Joseph responded to the final seduction. He left the garment in her hand and fled and got him out. Why does this say he got him out? Because no one else could have got him out, so he got himself out of trouble. There's one other point to notice. You got to make up your mind in advance what you're going to do. It's too late to pray about it when Potiphar's wife is playing kissy face with you. There's a time to talk and there's a time to stop talking. There's a time to stay and a time to go. There's a time to walk and there's a time to run away. Or, as the late Kenny Rogers sang, you got to know when to hold them. You got to know when to fold them. Know when to walk away, know when to run. When temptation comes, you got to move fast. God isn't obligated to give you a second chance to get out clean. He promised to make a way out, but he isn't obligated to give you 3 choices in case you don't like the first 2. Principle 4, when you do right, don't expect a reward. As you can imagine, Potiphar's wife wasn't too happy about all this. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. While Joseph is running half-dressed across the countryside, she's left with nothing but a handful of dirty laundry. This is not a good situation. 2 things happen in short order. Number 1, if you look at verses 13 through 18, she makes a false accusation. In essence, she accuses Joseph of attempted rape. When she calls him this Hebrew, There's even some racism in her words. Her words sound plausible because she's got Joseph's coat in her hand. Joseph is unjustly imprisoned. The Bible says that when Potiphar heard this story, his anger burned. So he had Joseph thrown into jail with the common criminals. How could such a thing happen? It happened because the world cannot understand a believer with conviction. That's why Joseph was locked up. He knew who he was, and he acted on his convictions. And his reward was a quick trip to jail. The good news is you can stand up to temptation. Bad news is you may end up losing your popularity in the process. After all, the world crucified Jesus. Why should you and I expect to get off any easier? Principle number 5, when you do right, God will honor you. Before we leave this story, we need to see how it ends. It's not the way we might have expected. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. At this moment, Joseph is chained in a filthy pit. Because of his faithfulness to God, he lost his job, his freedom, and his reputation, and he appears to be a ruined man. This story proves that God honors those who dare to say no. It may not appear that way at first. Things may not work out exactly like we think they will. But when we have the courage to say no to temptation, God takes care of the details. In the end, we will never be disappointed. Remember, it's always better to do right the first time. There are some things worse than going to jail for doing right. One of them is living in the prison of a guilty conscience. It is better to do right and sleep well than to toss and turn because you couldn't say no. There is a neat symmetry to the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. It opens with Joseph enjoying good success because the Lord was with him. Although he ends up in jail, even there he prospers because the Lord was with him. In between, he proves himself worthy of greatness because he knew how to say no. How did it happen? The answer is not hard to find. Joseph knew who he was. That was a settled issue, even though he was a teenager. He knew he belonged to God, and that made his decision easy. Here are 4 great don'ts to remember when you're tempted to sin. Number 1, don't forget who you are. Number 2, don't be surprised when temptation knocks at your door. Number 3, don't be deceived by persuasive voices. And number 4, don't be confused by the immediate results. If we're going to be victorious over temptation, we must do what Joseph did when Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce him. Just say no. When you're tempted to do wrong this week, just say no. When someone says, come sleep with me, take a deep breath, leave your coat behind, run the other way, and just say no. When Satan whispers in your ear, go on, do it. Everyone else is doing it. Remember who you are and just say no. When you feel like giving someone a piece of your mind, remember that you don't have a piece to spare. So grin and bear it and just say no. When your mind plays tricks on you and says, go ahead, no one will see you, remember that God sees everything you do, and then just say no. When it's 5:30 p.m. and the kids are cranky and your husband isn't home yet, and dinner isn't ready and the house is filled with dirty socks and dirty diapers, before you lose control, take a deep breath, look to heaven, count your blessings instead of your problems, and just say no. When you find yourself down and out, up against the wall and under the pile, when nothing is going right and you're hopelessly entangled and you see no way out of the mess you're in, before you say something you shouldn't say or do something you shouldn't do, before you blow your top or give up the ghost, Remember that God loves you, and then just say no. In the end, it comes down to a simple question. Christian, do you know who you are? Søren Kierkegaard said it this way, and now with God's help, I will become myself. Here's my whole sermon in one sentence. If you know who you are, you can serve Christ anywhere. Christian, do you know who you are? So now Joseph is in prison when he's about to get some company. You won't believe who shows up. Stay tuned. This story is far from over. Let us pray. God, thank you for this time. Thank you for challenging us with this word today about our identity. Help us to stand firm with whatever comes against us. Give us the ability to say no. Help us to trust you more than we trust our circumstances and our feelings. And help us to not be ashamed of this glorious, marvelous gospel. And now unto him who's able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before his presence with great joy. The only wise God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. Amen.